The wind had teeth that night. Elijah Brennan stood at his cabin window, watching the world disappear into white. The storm had been building since afternoon, rolling down from the Sangre de Cristo mountains like something with intention, something hungry. Now, past midnight, it had swallowed everything: the fence line, the horse barn, the scrub pines that marked the northern edge of his property. Even the mountains themselves had vanished, erased by the howling dark. Eli turned from the window and added another log to the fire. The wood cracked and settled, sending up a shower of sparks that died before reaching the stone chimney. He was 43 years old, though the mirror suggested older. His face was a map of hard winters and harder choices, lines carved deep around eyes the color of winter sky, a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, the gift of a Comanche lance 15 years past. His hands, scarred and calloused, moved with the efficiency of a man who had long ago stopped expecting comfort from the world. The cabin was small, built with his own hands from timber he'd cut and dragged down the mountainside. One room, barely large enough for a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and the stone fireplace that had taken him an entire summer to build. No pictures on the walls, no books except a water-damaged Bible he never opened. No photographs, no letters, no evidence that Elijah Brennan had ever been anything other than alone. He lived 20 miles from the nearest settlement, a dying town called Mineral Creek, where men still talked about the Apache wars as if they'd ended, as if signing papers in Washington had somehow stopped the bleeding. Eli knew better. He'd ridden with Colonel Davidson's column during the '68 campaigns, had seen things done and done things himself that no treaty could ever wash clean. That's why he'd come here, to this nowhere place where the wind never stopped and winter lasted 8 months, and a man could work himself to exhaustion every day and still not manage to sleep through the night. The horses were his only company, 4 mares and a stallion he'd gentled from wild stock. Good animals, strong and smart, worth more than everything else he owned combined. He sold them occasionally to ranchers who didn't ask questions, took the money, and bought supplies enough to last another season. It was a life stripped to its bones, and that suited him fine. Around 2 in the morning, Eli lay in his bed listening to the storm shake the cabin's frame. Sleep wouldn't come, but that was nothing new. Sleep meant dreams, and dreams meant remembering, and remembering meant seeing faces he had no right to see. Faces of the dead, some he'd killed, some he'd failed to save, all of them waiting in that space between waking and darkness. Then he heard it. A sound that didn't belong, not the wind, not the groan of stressed timber, not the distant howl of wolves. Something else. Something that might have been a cry, might have been nothing, might have been his own guilt finally taking audible form. Eli sat up, listening. There it was again, faint, almost lost in the storm's fury, but present, human. He pulled on his boots, his heavy coat, wrapped a scarf around his face. The Henry rifle leaned against the wall by the door, and his hand hovered over it for a moment before moving away. Whatever was out there, a gun wouldn't help, not in this storm, not in this cold. The moment he opened the door, the wind tried to tear it from his hands. Snow drove into his face like frozen needles, stealing his breath. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since sundown. This was the kind of cold that killed, that found any weakness and exploited it without mercy. Eli pulled the door shut behind him and stepped into the white chaos. Visibility was perhaps 10 feet. Beyond that, nothing but howling emptiness. He'd tied a rope from his door to the barn last week, knowing nights like this would come. His hand found the rough hemp and followed it, one step at a time, bent against the wind's assault. The sound came again, clearer now that he was outside. Not from the barn, from somewhere past it, out toward the open range. Fool, he thought, Whatever's out there is already dead. But his feet kept moving. He left the rope behind, pushing into the storm with nothing but instinct and that sound, that cry that might have been wind, might have been animal, might have been the ghost of his conscience, finally demanding payment. 50 yards from the cabin, he nearly stepped on her. The snow had drifted around a fallen piñon, creating a depression that had filled and covered. Only the faintest darkness visible beneath the white, a shape that resolved into a hand, small and brown and utterly still. Eli dropped to his knees and began digging with his bare hands. Snow burned his skin, but he didn't stop. In seconds, he'd uncovered a face. A child's face. A girl no more than 9 or 10, her skin dark bronze, her black hair frozen into sheets of ice. She wore traditional Apache clothing, buckskin and beadwork, now soaked through and crusted with frost. Her lips were blue, her eyes were closed. She wasn't moving. For a long moment, Elijah Brennan knelt in the snow and stared at that small, frozen face, and felt the full weight of 15 years crash down on him. He knew what she was. He knew what helping her might mean. In this territory, in this time, an Apache child found on a white man's property could mean only one thing to her people: abduction, harm, another wound in a war that had never really ended. And if she died here, if he buried her without telling anyone, no one would ever know. The storm would cover everything. But looking at her face, seeing the delicate curve of her cheek, the way her small hand had reached out, even in unconsciousness, Eli saw other faces. The faces from that village in the canyon, the faces he'd spent 15 years trying to forget. And he made his choice. He scooped her into his arms, so light, so terribly cold, and turned back toward the cabin. The wind fought him every step. Snow filled his tracks as fast as he made them. Twice he fell, his burden clutched tight to his chest. Twice he got back up. When he finally crashed through his cabin door, he was hypothermic himself, his hands numb, his face raw and bleeding from windburn. But the girl was still in his arms, still might be alive. He laid her on his bed near the fire and began the work of saving her life. First, the wet clothes. His hands shook as he peeled away the frozen buckskin, trying to be gentle, trying not to think about what this looked like, what anyone would think if they saw. He wrapped her in every dry blanket he owned, then heated water and began the slow process of warming her. Cloths soaked in warm water pressed to her neck, her wrists, her core. Not too hot. Too fast would kill her as surely as the cold. Her pulse was there, faint as a whisper, but there. Dawn was still hours away. Eli fed the fire, boiled more water, made a weak tea from herbs he kept for illness. He'd learned basic medicine during his cavalry days, enough to know she might still die. Hypothermia led to pneumonia. Pneumonia, in a child this fragile, often led to death. But he'd be damned if he let that happen without a fight. As the first grey light began seeping through the window, the girl stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, dark eyes, disoriented and filled with sudden terror. She saw him, saw a white man leaning over her, and tried to scream. "Easy," Eli said, raising his hands, backing away. "Easy, child, you're safe." She didn't understand the words, but she understood the gun rack on the wall, the white face, the cabin that smelled of wood smoke and horses. She tried to sit up, tangled in blankets, her small face contorted with fear. Eli moved slowly, keeping his hands visible, and picked up a cup of water. He took a drink himself, then offered it to her. "Water," he said, making the gesture of drinking. She watched him with the wariness of a wounded animal, calculating distance to the door, assessing threats. But she was also desperately thirsty. Slowly, she reached out and took the cup. Drank. Her hands shook so badly that water spilled down her chin. When the cup was empty, Eli refilled it, offered bread. She took it, never taking her eyes off him. They sat in silence as dawn grew stronger outside. The storm had passed, leaving a world transformed. Everything buried, everything clean and white and deadly quiet. Eli knew what was coming, knew it in his bones. He went to the window and looked out at his small domain. The cabin, the barn, the corral, all of it pristine and perfect in fresh snow. And beyond, emerging from the tree line like a vision from another age, came the riders. Not a few, not a dozen, hundreds. They appeared in complete silence, mounted warriors on painted horses spreading across the Grand Valley floor, in a formation that was both military precision and something older, something that predated European warfare by thousands of years. They wore winter clothing, furs and leather, their faces marked with paint and weather. Their weapons, rifles, bows, lances, remained sheathed, not threatening, but undeniably present. They came like the dawn itself, inevitable and absolute, and they surrounded his cabin completely. Eli stood at the window, his breath fogging the glass, and counted. 200, 300, 400 warriors, maybe more, creating a perfect circle around his property. Not advancing, not calling out, just waiting. In the center, on a white horse that stood like carved ivory against the snow, sat a man Eli recognized. Not by name, they'd never spoken. But 15 years ago, in a canyon that ran red with blood, Eli had seen this face. Younger then, but unmistakable. A chief whose family had been in that village, whose wife had died in the initial volley, whose older children had been among those who fled into the rocks, and whose youngest daughter had been nowhere to be found. Until now. Behind him, Eli heard the girl gasp, heard her whisper something in a language he didn't speak, heard her scramble from the bed toward the window. She saw them, saw her people, saw her father on the white horse, and began to cry, not from fear now, but from relief so profound it shook her small frame. Eli stood very still, his hand resting on the windowsill, and felt the weight of the past and the weight of the present pressing down like that snow outside, like something that could bury you if you weren't careful, if you didn't keep moving, if you stopped even for a moment to acknowledge how heavy it all was. The sun cleared the mountains, and the world blazed with reflected light, and 400 Apache warriors sat on their horses in complete, absolute silence, waiting. The morning stretched like a held breath. Eli stood at his window. The girl, Kia, he'd learned her name through gestures and her repeated whisper, standing beside him now, her small hand gripping his rough sleeve. She'd stopped crying, but her eyes remained fixed on that circle of warriors, on the man on the white horse at their center. Time moved strangely. Minutes felt like hours. The sun climbed higher, and still no one moved. Eli understood what this was. Not quite a siege, not quite a rescue. Something else. Something ceremonial and dangerous and impossibly delicate. They could have attacked. They had the numbers, had the position, had every reason to assume the worst. But they hadn't. The silence itself was a message, though Eli wasn't certain he could read it correctly. "Your father," he said quietly, knowing she couldn't understand but needing to speak. "That's him, isn't it? On the white horse?" Kia looked up at him with those dark eyes and nodded slowly. Eli felt something crack in his chest. Not quite pain, not quite relief. Something that had been frozen for 15 years beginning to shift and break. He'd known, on some level, that this moment would come. Not this exact moment, he could never have imagined this, but some reckoning, some accounting. A man couldn't do what he'd done, be part of what he'd been part of, and expect to simply fade away into the mountains without consequence. The dead didn't forget. The wounded didn't forget. And neither, apparently, did fathers whose daughters went missing in snowstorms. "I need to go out there," Eli said, more to himself than to Kia. "I need to—" He trailed off, unsure what he needed to do. Explain? Apologize? Surrender? Kia's grip tightened on his sleeve. She looked up at him and shook her head firmly, then spoke in rapid Apache, words tumbling over each other. He caught the tone, warning, pleading. Whatever she was saying, she didn't want him to go out there. But what choice was there? Eli gently removed her hand from his sleeve and walked to his coat. He pulled it on slowly, then opened the door. The cold hit him immediately, but it was nothing compared to the weight of those hundreds of eyes. Every warrior watched him with the intensity of men who had learned to read enemies at distance, who could see death coming over the horizon. Eli forced himself to walk steadily, boots crunching through the snow, his arms held away from his body to show he carried no weapons. 50 feet from his door, he stopped. The silence was so complete he could hear the sound of a horse shifting its weight, leather creaking, the faint whistle of wind through the valley. Behind him, he sensed Kia at the cabin door, watching. The chief on the white horse watched him for a long moment, his face carved from stone, unreadable. Then, with a movement so fluid it seemed choreographed, he dismounted. He was tall, taller than Eli had expected, with the kind of strength that came from a life lived entirely outdoors, entirely on the edge. His face bore the marks of leadership, lines of worry and responsibility, scars from battles survived. His eyes, when they met Eli's, held depths that made Eli want to look away. But he didn't. He held that gaze, held it through the weight of recognition that passed between them. "Yes, I know you. Yes, I was there. Yes, I remember." The chief walked forward, closing the distance until he stood directly before Eli. Close enough that Eli could have reached out and touched him. Close enough that either of them could have drawn a weapon and ended this. Neither did. Instead, the chief spoke. His voice was deep, measured, speaking in English that carried only a slight accent. "You know who I am?" It wasn't a question. "No," Eli said quietly. "I don't know your name, but I remember the canyon, 15 years ago." "Cañón del Muerto," the chief said. "Valley of Death. Your people named it well that day." Eli flinched, but didn't look away. "Yes." "You remember my face?" "Yes." "You were a soldier then, a tracker for Davidson's column." "I was. You led them to our village, our winter camp, where women and children sheltered from the cold. Every word was a knife. Every word was deserved." "I did," Eli said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, hollow, distant. "My wife died in the first moments," the chief continued, his voice terrifyingly calm. "My oldest son took a bullet protecting his sisters. He was 13. My second daughter—" He paused, and for the first time emotion cracked through. "She fell from the cliff trying to escape. Her body was found 3 days later." Eli felt the words like blows. "I can't. There's nothing I can say that—" "No," the chief agreed. "There is not." They stood in silence. Behind them, the circle of warriors remained motionless. Inside the cabin, Kia waited. "My name is Nata'an," the chief said finally. "It means wise one. A name given before I learned how little wisdom means against cannon fire." He gestured toward the cabin. "The child you pulled from the snow. She is Kia, my youngest, the only daughter I have left." "I didn't know," Eli said. "I swear I didn't—" "No?" Nata'an's voice sharpened. "What does knowing matter? You find an Apache child freezing in a storm. You could leave her. Many would. Most would. Your people have made it clear that our children's lives have no value." "That's not—" Eli stopped, because what could he say? It was true. He'd seen it happen, had been part of it happening. But you did not leave her, Nata'an continued. You brought her inside, warmed her, gave her water, food, protected her through the night. He took a step closer, and Eli saw now that the chief's eyes were wet. Why? The question hung between them like something physical. Why? Because he was tired of being the man who walked away. Because 15 years of isolation hadn't been enough to wash away what he'd done. Because when he looked at that small, frozen face, he'd seen all the faces he couldn't save and decided, just once, to make a different choice. Because she was a child, Eli said finally. Because she was dying. Because, he drew a shaking breath, because I couldn't leave her. Nata'an studied him for a long moment, and Eli felt himself being weighed, measured, assessed in ways that went beyond words. You know what my warriors expect, Nata'an said quietly. They know who you were. Some of them fought in that canyon. Some of them lost family. They want justice. I understand. Do you? Nata'an's voice was sharp. Do you understand that by saving one child, you have created an impossible situation? That I owe you a life debt for my daughter, while simultaneously owing my people justice for their dead? Do you understand that you have forced me to choose between honor and vengeance? Eli hadn't thought of it that way. Hadn't thought beyond the moment of finding her, saving her. But he saw it now. The knife's edge Nata'an walked, the impossible balance. I didn't mean to. Intent means nothing, Nata'an cut him off. Only consequence matters, and the consequence is that I stand here, before my warriors, before my people, owing a debt to a man I have every right to kill. From the cabin, a small voice called out, Shijie! Father. Both men turned. Kia stood in the doorway, wrapped in one of Eli's blankets, her small form silhouetted against the firelight behind her. She called out again, longer sentences, urgent and pleading. Nata'an listened, his face softening for the first time. When she finished, he turned back to Eli. She says you were kind, that you could have hurt her but you did not, that your hands were gentle when you warmed her, that you gave her your own bed, your own blankets, that when she woke and was afraid, you showed her respect. He paused. She says you cried when you thought she was sleeping, that you whispered words in English she did not understand, but she heard the sorrow in them. Eli felt exposed, flayed open. He had cried. In the darkest part of the night, sitting by the fire while Kia slept, he'd wept like he hadn't wept since the canyon. For her, for himself, for all the children whose names he'd never known. She says, Nata'an continued, his voice very soft now, that you are carrying ghosts, that she could see them around you, heavy on your shoulders. And she says, you let her live when you could have let her die, and that means you are not the man you once were. Eli couldn't speak. His throat was too tight, his chest too full. Nata'an took another step forward, and now they were close enough that Eli could see the war happening in the chief's eyes, rage and grief battling against gratitude and obligation. You saved my daughter's life, Nata'an said. By our laws, by our ways, that creates a bond that cannot be broken. You are now under the protection of our people. Before Eli could process this, Nata'an continued, his voice hardening. But you are also the man who helped destroy my family, who participated in the massacre at Cañón del Muerto. And that debt, he gestured to the circle of warriors, that debt demands payment. So what happens now? Eli asked quietly. Nata'an looked at him for a long moment, then turned and called out in Apache. The warriors responded as one, not with violence, but with a complex series of movements. Some dismounted, others repositioned their horses. The circle began to shift and change, becoming something else, some pattern Eli couldn't yet understand. Now, Natan said, turning back to him. We honor both debts, and you must prove yourself worthy of the life my daughter claims you deserve. How? By standing in the circle of judgment, Natan said. By allowing my people to bear witness to what you were and what you might be. By submitting yourself to our justice and our mercy, and trusting that we are capable of both. Eli looked at the warriors, at their impassive faces, at the weapons they carried. Then he looked back at the cabin, where Kia watched with hope and fear mingled in her dark eyes. He thought about running, thought about fighting, thought about all the choices that had led him to this moment, standing in the snow surrounded by the people he'd wronged, given an opportunity he didn't deserve. And he thought about the weight he'd carried for 15 years, and how tired he was. All right, he said. I'll stand for your judgment. Natan nodded slowly. Then we begin. The circle closed around him. Warriors formed a living wall, their horses breathing clouds into the frozen air, their faces a gallery of judgment. Eli stood at the center, alone, feeling smaller than he'd ever felt in his life. The sun reflected off the snow with blinding brightness, making the world seem overexposed, too vivid, too real. Natan remained beside him, and Eli realized this was deliberate. The chief placing himself between Eli and his warriors, a physical manifestation of the impossible position they all occupied. We will hear testimony, Natan announced, his voice carrying across the circle. Those who have words to speak, speak now. An older warrior dismounted, his face deeply lined, his hair more gray than black. He walked forward until he stood before Eli, looking him directly in the eyes. I am Goyakla, he said, his English careful and precise. I was at Cañón del Muerto. I watched soldiers shoot my sister as she ran. She was carrying her infant son. Both died. He paused, letting the words settle. I have dreamed of revenge for 15 winters. Eli forced himself not to look away. I'm sorry. Sorry? Goyakla's voice rose. Your sorry means nothing. Words are wind. Your actions, those speak truth. You wore the uniform. You carried the rifle. You led them to us. Yes, Eli said simply. I did. And now? Goyakla demanded. Now you live alone in the mountains, thinking isolation is penance. Thinking that if you hurt no one else, you are forgiven. No, Eli said, his voice steady despite the fear crawling up his spine. I don't think I'm forgiven. I don't think I can be forgiven. Then why save the child? Another voice, another warrior stepping forward. Younger, his face still bearing the tattoos of recent battles. Why risk yourself for one of us? Eli looked at him, then at Goyakla, then slowly around the circle at all the faces watching him. He saw anger there, yes, but also curiosity. Also something that might have been hope. Because, he said quietly, I couldn't save the others, the ones in the canyon. I dream about them. Every night I see their faces. And when I found Kia in the snow, he stopped, swallowed hard. I couldn't walk away. Not again. Not ever again. Pretty words, Goyakla spat. But words do not bring back the dead. No, Eli agreed. They don't. Nothing does. But I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking for anything except, he struggled to find the right language, except maybe the chance to be better than I was, to make different choices. One choice, the younger warrior said. One child saved. Does that balance the scales? No, Eli said immediately. It doesn't. It can't. There are no scales. There's no math that makes this right. Then why should we not kill you? Goyakla demanded. Why should we not take the justice we are owed? Natan raised his hand and the circle fell silent. He looked at Eli with those deep, measuring eyes. Answer him, Natan said softly. Why should you live? It was the question Eli had been asking himself for 15 years. The question that had driven him into the mountains, into isolation, into a life stripped of everything except survival. Why should he live when so many others had died? He'd never had an answer. Not one that satisfied. Not one that felt true. But standing here, surrounded by the people he'd wronged, with Kia watching from the cabin door, something shifted inside him. Some frozen thing beginning to thaw. "I don't know if I should," he said slowly. "That's not my judgment to make. It's yours. But I know," he drew a breath, "I know that killing me won't bring anyone back. Won't undo what was done. Won't heal the wounds." He looked directly at Goyakla. "Your sister will still be dead. Your nephew will still be dead. My death won't change that." "It will bring satisfaction," Goyakla said coldly. "Will it?" Eli asked. "Will it really? Or will it just add one more body to the pile? One more ghost to the collection we're all carrying?" Silence. Heavy and profound. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," Eli continued, his voice gaining strength. "I'm not asking you to forget. What happened in that canyon was evil, and I was part of it, and I'll carry that until I die. But," he gestured to the cabin, to Kia, "but if there's any possibility, any chance at all, that something different can happen, that one person can make a different choice, and that choice can matter, then maybe—" He trailed off, unable to finish. "Maybe what?" Nata'an prompted. "Maybe there's a way forward," Eli said quietly. "Not forgetting, not erasing, but different, better, for your children and mine, if I ever have any, for all the children who don't have to keep paying for what their fathers and grandfathers did to each other." The silence stretched. Eli watched warriors glancing at each other, saw subtle shifts in body language, some still rigid with anger, others thoughtful, considering. Finally, an elderly woman pushed through the circle on foot, leaning on a carved walking stick. Her face was a map of years beyond counting, her eyes sharp despite her age. She approached Eli slowly, then walked completely around him, studying him from every angle. When she completed the circle, she spoke in Apache to Nata'an. A long stream of words, her voice cracking with age, but firm with authority. Nata'an listened intently, nodding occasionally. When she finished, she looked at Eli one more time, then turned and walked back through the circle. "That is Beshar," Nata'an said. "She is our eldest, our wisdom keeper. She has seen more winters than I have been alive." "What did she say?" Eli asked. "She said you carry death inside you, but also life. That you are a man standing between two worlds, belonging to neither. That this is the most dangerous place for a man to stand, but also the most necessary." Nata'an paused. "She said that my daughter's life is worth more than vengeance, and that if you are willing to live with the weight of what you've done, truly live with it, not hide from it, then perhaps something can be built from these ruins." Eli felt tears on his face, but didn't raise his hand to wipe them. "I don't know how," he admitted. "I don't know how to live with it. I've been trying for 15 years and I still don't know." "Then you will learn," Nata'an said, "with our help, if you choose it." "What does that mean?" Nata'an gestured to the circle of warriors. "It means you become part of us. Not Apache. You cannot be what you are not, but not separate either. It means you live here, in this place between our world and yours, and you help us when we need help, and we help you when you need help. It means you raise horses and trade with both peoples, and you refuse to take sides when your government comes demanding scouts and guides to hunt my people." "They'll call me a traitor," Eli said. "Yes." "They'll come after me." "Yes." "I'll lose everything." "Everything?" Nata'an's eyes were sharp. "You live alone in a cabin with no pictures, no family, no friends. What exactly will you lose?" Eli opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. What would he lose? The fiction of respectability, the illusion that he could somehow outrun his past, the false comfort of believing his isolation was noble instead of cowardly. "You're right," he said finally. "I have nothing to lose." "No," Nata'an corrected. "You have everything to gain. Purpose, redemption, a reason to wake each morning that isn't just survival. And," he glanced toward the cabin where Kia still watched, "the knowledge that you saved my daughter's life, and in doing so, perhaps saved your own soul." "I don't deserve." "Deserve?" Nata'an cut him off, his voice sharp. "None of us deserve anything. We are born into a world we did not make, forced to fight wars we did not start, dying for reasons beyond our control. Deserve has nothing to do with it. This is about choice, about deciding in this moment who you want to be." Eli looked around the circle one more time, saw faces still hard with anger, but also saw curiosity, saw possibility, saw, perhaps, the faint outline of something that might be hope. "I choose this," he said quietly. "I choose to try." Nata'an nodded slowly, then turned and spoke to the gathered warriors in Apache. His words were formal, ceremonial, carrying weight and authority. When he finished, the warriors responded, not with cheers, not with celebration, but with a single, unified movement. Each man raised his right hand, palm forward, in a gesture of acknowledgement. Not forgiveness, not acceptance, but acknowledgement. Witness. "It is decided," Nata'an said. "You are under our protection. Any who harm you, harm us. But you are also bound by oath. If you betray this trust, if you lead soldiers to our people, if you profit from our suffering, the protection ends, and justice will find you, no matter where you run." "I understand," Eli said. "Then we seal it properly." Nata'an drew a knife from his belt, not threatening, but ceremonial. He held out his palm, drew the blade across it in one swift motion. Blood welled up, bright against his dark skin. He offered the knife to Eli. Eli took it, feeling the weight of the moment. He'd spilled blood before, too much blood, for the wrong reasons. But this was different. This was a choice, freely made, with eyes open to the consequences. He cut his own palm. The pain was sharp, clean, almost welcome. Nata'an grasped his hand, their blood mingling, running down their wrists to drip into the snow between them. Red on white. "By this blood," Nata'an said, "by the life you saved and the lives you took, by the debt owed and the debt paid, we are bound. Not as friends, friendship must be earned, but as people trying to find a path forward through this world that has gone mad." "By this blood," Eli repeated, "I swear to honor this bond, to live with integrity, to make different choices than I made before, to be worthy of the mercy you've shown." They held the grip for a long moment, both men's blood soaking into the snow, creating a small dark stain that would freeze and remain long after they'd released their hands and bound their wounds. When they finally let go, something had changed. Some invisible shift in the atmosphere, in the quality of the silence. The circle of warriors began to move, reforming, preparing to depart. But there was no hostility now, only wariness, and the kind of respect that comes from witnessing something genuine and costly. Goyakla approached one more time. He looked at Eli for a long moment, his face still hard, still marked by grief and anger. Then he spoke, his voice low enough that only Eli and Nata'an could hear. "I do not forgive you," he said. "I cannot. My sister's ghost stands between us. But," he drew a difficult breath, "but I acknowledge what you did for the child, and I will watch to see what kind of man you become. Perhaps," he paused, struggling with the words, "perhaps there is more courage in living with what you've done than in dying to escape it." Then he turned and mounted his horse, riding back to join the others. One by one, the warriors departed, moving out across the snow in the same eerie silence with which they'd arrived. Within minutes, the circle had dissolved, the valley returning to its usual emptiness, the white expanse unmarked except for hundreds of hoofprints, and that one small stain of blood where Eli and Natan had stood. But Natan remained, and from the cabin, Kia finally ventured out, running through the snow toward her father. He caught her up in his arms, holding her tight, his face buried in her hair. When he finally set her down, he knelt beside her, checking her over carefully, satisfying himself that she was truly well. They spoke in rapid Apache, her small hands gesturing excitedly, his responses quiet and measured. Finally, he stood and faced Eli. "She wants to know if you will teach her about horses," he said, something that might have been humor touching his eyes. Eli was taken off guard. "Yes, if you permit it. She says you told her, showed her with gestures, that you have a mare who is pregnant, that there will be a foal in the spring. She wants to see it when it comes." "She's welcome to," Eli said, "any time." Natan studied him for a moment, then nodded. "We will come in the spring, and we will see if this path we have chosen leads somewhere worth going." He turned to mount his white horse, then paused and looked back. "The old woman Beshar told me something else," he said. "She said that sometimes the world creates moments that can change everything. Moments where the past and the future hang in perfect balance, and one choice, one action, can shift which direction things go. She said this is such a moment. That what happens next, how you live your life from this day forward, will ripple out in ways neither of us can predict." "That's," Eli struggled to find words, "that's a heavy burden." "Yes," Natan agreed. "But you carried the burden of death for 15 years. Perhaps now you can carry the burden of life instead. See which is heavier." With that, he lifted Kia onto the horse in front of him, turned, and rode out across the snow, following his warriors back toward whatever hidden camps they called home. Eli stood alone in his yard, surrounded by disturbed snow and fading hoofprints, his hand wrapped in a strip of cloth torn from his shirt, blood seeping through. The sun was high now, the cold intense but no longer hostile. Just cold, just winter, just the world being itself. He looked down at his wrapped hand, at the blood seeping through. Then he looked at the cabin, at the fire still burning inside, at the blankets Kia had left in a small pile on his bed. For the first time in 15 years, Elijah Brennan felt something he'd forgotten was possible. Not forgiveness, he didn't deserve that, and knew he never would. Not redemption, that was too grand a word for one good deed in a lifetime of mistakes. But possibility. The faint, fragile possibility that the man he was yesterday didn't have to be the man he would be tomorrow. He walked back to his cabin, closed the door against the cold, and began the work of cleaning up, putting blankets away, washing dishes, tending the fire. Simple tasks, ordinary tasks, the kind of tasks that made up a life. But now they felt different. Now they felt like building something instead of hiding from something. Now they felt like the beginning of a path forward instead of a dead end. Spring would come. It always did, no matter how long the winter. And when it came, there would be a foal, and a young Apache girl who wanted to see it, and a chief who was willing to give him a chance he didn't deserve. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and gentle this time, covering the bloodstain in the yard, covering the hoofprints, covering everything in fresh white. Not erasing, just covering. Just giving the world a chance to begin again. Eli stood at his window, watching the snow fall. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he thought about tomorrow with something other than dread. It wasn't much, but it was something. And sometimes, in the cold and the dark, Something is all you need to keep going. Sometimes, something is enough. The weight of snow is nothing compared to the weight of choice. But at least snow melts in spring.